Well, good morning, everyone. How are you?
Good morning.
Good to be with you. I came to Jesus Christ in November of 1968. That's 42 years ago. And my wife actually became a believer about 44 years ago. We've been married for 37 years. And the theme of this conference is actually the theme verse of our marriage and our lives, to deny ourselves and to follow Christ. Yesterday, one of you asked me a question. Dr. Moreland, you've known the Lord now for over 40 years. How have you stayed motivated all this time? How have you been able to sustain your commitment to Jesus Christ for over 4 decades? Now, that's not an unimportant question, is it? Because you don't want to come to a conference like this and burn out 2 weeks later. You don't want to be on fire for Christ in your 20s, and less so in your 30s, and then even less so in your 40s. It actually ought to be the other way around. The 30s should be better than the 20s. The 40s should be better than the 30s, and so on. That means that the older you get, the closer to God you become, and the more on fire for Christ your life is. And that's what you want out of your life. The question is, how do you maintain a sense of motivation to be committed to Jesus Christ over the long duration of a lifetime instead of in a short term? Because you see, Christianity is a cross-country race. It's not a 100-yard dash or a 100-meter dash. You have to stay at it over the long haul. So again, I say, how do you stay motivated to follow Christ over the length of an entire lifetime? Now, I'm going to address that question in my 3 sessions with you this week. But I want to begin this morning by addressing that question in a way that you might find to be a little bit odd or bizarre. Because what I'm going to do is to say that you are motivated in following Christ by thinking very, very hard about the implications of atheism. Now, before you think that I'm half crazy up here, let me remind you that you appreciate health most when you're sick. Or you tend to appreciate friendships when you're lonely and isolated and by yourself. And I believe that a person tends to appreciate God and everything they have in the gospel when they think long and hard about what it would be like if God were not real. So what would follow if God were not real? What would follow if Jesus Christ were a legend and the whole Christian faith were a fabrication and just a series of stories? Now, fortunately, I'm on good grounds for our time this morning, because there is a text of Scripture in the Old Testament, which is one of the most profound passages in all the Bible, that actually considers this question about what would follow if the God of the Bible is not real. And that is found in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Would you please turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Ecclesiastes. Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate that word of encouragement. The book of Ecclesiastes is right after the Proverbs, which is right after the Psalms. We're going to take a look at the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1. Now, I'm going to ask you to do something with me this morning. I don't know if you can do this early. May I ask you to think, because this is going to be a very intellectually difficult morning. Not so tomorrow morning, and not so the morning after that. But this is going to require some intellectual effort on your part to understand what is going on. But I assure you the rewards will be worth it. Are you willing to think with me this morning? Can you do that to some degree? Maybe you need to go quickly and get another cup of coffee. Who knows? Let's begin then. This is written by Solomon. And let's begin by reading the first few verses. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. Everything is completely vain. Now, this is a very, very pessimistic, sour book. In fact, the word for vain, the Hebrew word for vain, occurs 37 times in this book, and it only occurs 33 times in the rest of the Old Testament. So that one word occurs more often in the 12 chapters of Ecclesiastes than it does in the entire rest of the Old Testament put together. As a matter of fact, this book is so pessimistic that when Jewish rabbis met in 90 AD at the Council of Jamni to reinvestigate the canon of the Old Testament, a number of Jewish rabbis voted that Ecclesiastes should not be included in the Scriptures because no believer in God could be as pessimistic as the author of the book of Ecclesiastes. And he is basically saying that life is completely empty and pointless and without any purpose to it whatsoever. Now, the key to interpreting the book, and this is what I want you to see, is the phrase, under the sun and under heaven. This occurs, for example, in verse 3. What advantage does man have in all of his work which he does where? Under the sun. Verse 9. That which has been and that which will be is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. See, there is nothing new under the sun. The phrase under the sun, under heaven occurs all throughout this book. Now please listen. Solomon is asking the question, if God does not exist and the physical world is all there is, so that the natural world is all that exists, and there is no transcendent God, if we consider that hypothesis for a minute, is there any purpose to life? And his answer is no. If God does not exist, and we only consider the world under the sun, that is, as a self-contained naturalistic system, today this would be philosophical naturalism. This is the view that the physical universe is all there is, and there is nothing that exists that is not ultimately physical in nature. So on this view, chemistry and physics describe reality the way it is, and the humanities and all the fields outside of the hard sciences are really not dealing with anything that's real. Now, this is the worldview that he wants to consider. And he says, given that worldview, human life is completely vain. Now, the Hebrew word for vain has two meanings to it. And both are intended here, as we're going to see in just a minute. The first meaning is fleeting or momentary. It was used of a person's breath, which was blown on a utensil in the morning. So you get up, and suppose you have a glass, and you go, and your breath is there, and it's gone instantaneously. And so basically what Solomon is saying is that your life and my life are completely vain because they're not here for very long. And if you stop to think about it, it really doesn't matter if you live 10 or 15 years or 30 years or 90 years. In the overall scheme of things, the difference between 90 years and 15 or 20 years is not that much. So that you are not going to be here for very long. And that raises the question, does it matter that you were here in the first place? Given that you're here and gone, and that's the end of you, would the world have been that much different if you'd never been born? And Solomon's conclusion is no, the world wouldn't have been much different. It really doesn't matter that you were born into this world. You don't make a difference. You don't matter. Your life is utterly vain and meaningless because it's too brief to count. Those of us that are getting older know what that's like. Even those of you in your 20s and 30s can look back at the time you were in elementary school and you see how fast that's gone. It just seems like it was the other day when you were in junior high school. And now that I'm 62, I can't tell you where the time is going. Life is very, very brief. And this raises a terrible sense of angst or discouragement, because death awaits all of us. And death awaits us at the end of a very, very brief life. And the question can be raised, is there a purpose to our lives? The second use of the word vain, in addition to fleeting, is the word futile, or without purpose. And what Solomon is suggesting is, if God does not exist, not only is your life brief, but there's no purpose to it. There's no goal, there's no end for the sake of why you're here. You are, in other words, an accident. You're not here for a purpose of any kind. Now, we're going to see in a little bit what would happen to a culture if these ideas become believed by a substantial portion of the population, as they are now. And as I'm going to show you tomorrow morning, one of the things that will happen in a culture where a lot of people believe this is the depression rate will increase appreciably. And as I'll show you tomorrow morning, the depression rate, since this worldview has become prominent, has gone up 10 times. Now, this is not, remember, this is not a conclusion that Solomon has reached. It's a hypothesis he wants to test. And the hypothesis that he wants to test is this hypothesis. If there is no God, and the world that science tells us about is all that's real, then is there any hope for me to have anything but a vain life? And he says no, because you have two problems. The first one is you're brief, you're not here very long, and second, there's no purpose for why you're here. Now, the next few verses are among the most profound and the hardest to understand in the Bible, but they're so profound that it's going to take everything I have to explain them to you. You're going to read them with me, and they're going to look like gobbledygook. But I assure you, these are deep indeed. We're going to enter deep waters because we're going to look at verses 3 through 7. Because now we're going to find Solomon giving an argument for the vain hypothesis. He's not going to ask you to accept this claim by faith. He's actually going to give you an argument that you could use with an unbeliever for why his life makes no difference if God doesn't exist. This is a powerful argument. Here it is. Verse 3 to 7. What advantage does a man have in all of his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place it rises there again. Blowing toward the south and turning toward the north, the wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. And all I can say as a professional philosopher, when I read a text like this, is that this is unbelievably profound. Now, he is advancing an argument to support the conclusion that if God does not exist, everything, especially human life, is completely vain. What